Welcome everyone to our panel, The Future of Energy. As we all know, scientists basically are in agreement that human activity is causing catastrophic damage to our climate, and that's only going to get worse in the future. Just last month, we had a record heat wave across the Siberian Arctic that they said would basically only happen 1 in every 80,000 years if it wasn't for human interference. We have deforestation accelerating in places like Indonesia and Brazil, and many people are calling this the last decade that we can really get our act together. So today, hopefully, with the assistance of some of our panelists, we're going to get to the heart of some of these issues, from renewable energy to public policy. We're going to look at it all. We're going to look at how Hong Kong can find itself on the pathway towards a green future. I will be your moderator, Thomas Corbin. I'm the founder of RH Software, a company that aims to use the impact and reach of technology to solve the greatest social, cultural, and environmental problems of our generation. And we are hosted here today by Accelerate, a company founded by my long-term friend, Lavina Hamlani, who I go back many, many, many years. And Accelerate is dedicated to reinventing the tech education field, as I'm sure many of you know, in areas like AI, software engineering, machine learning, and blockchain, but not just reinventing those fields sort of to promote people getting into those industries, but also using those industries to help some of these challenges that we face, like the climate crisis. And we are being joined by these 4 brilliant panelists here today. I'm going to give a quick overview of all of them, and then we can dive a little bit more into who they are and what they do during the panel. So first up, we have Max Song, an investor, a data scientist, and a Schwarzman scholar. He's the founder of Global Solutions Festival and a venture partner at PCG. He's focusing his attention on how COVID-19 has affected global sustainability, and he's been building several products that will help to address climate change. And I've tested a few of them personally. Next up, we have Cameron Jones, Division Head of Innovation and Sustainability at Blocks EDU. He holds numerous accolades in the sustainability field, too many to mention here, but he has led multiple projects under the government of Alberta's climate leadership and contributed to energy policy as far away as the United Kingdom. We also have Christina Tang, founder of Blue Sky Energy Technology, a company that creates sustainable buildings and lively communities. Their specialty is in smart sensor deployment, data-driven analytics, and user engagement. She also serves on the Energy Advisory Committee and Advisory Council on the Environment of Hong Kong SAR's government. And last but not least, we have Averey Chan, the lead for business development and engineering at Nefin Group, a regional solar developer delivering climate neutrality throughout Asia. They have already collectively delivered almost 300 million watts of utility-scale rooftop solar systems regionally throughout Asia. And their mission is to achieve carbon neutrality for all companies. So just to start off this panel, the first question I'd like to pose to Max Song, and it's to do with why do we need to reduce emissions? What is going on that's causing us to be forced to take such drastic actions?
Thank you very much. And I just want to say, Tom, you have a wonderful announcer voice. So if the RT software doesn't work out, you could also be a sportscaster. I think you're very good at it. I think that what most people are not aware of is that we are on our very quick way to exhausting the carbon budget. And the carbon budget is something that is easy to put things into and very expensive to take things out of. So by some estimates, we have less than 8 years left until we have totally used up all of the CO2 we can emit into the atmosphere and still stay underneath 1.5 degrees. I'll just say one sentence about why I think, like most people think that global warming is going to affect them through rising sea levels. And it is true that is going to be one very visible aspect of global warming. But that's actually not the thing you should be worried about the most. The worried about most actually is the changes in extreme weather events that will totally disrupt the supply of food we have on the planet. Already we see this happening very recently with the flooding that's happened in mainland China. And now, China's on high alert actually for the rest of its food production capabilities. And when several countries start seeing their food agricultural output start to decrease, we will actually have a very, very scary situation. So so I think it is imperative for us to actually just to try to control the total amount of CO2 we emit, and it is within this decade that we will decide if we have achieved it or not. Of the emissions that we have going out into the atmosphere, 55% of it comes from energy, and 45% comes from all the stuff we make or use. So in terms of addressing more than 50% of the problem, this panel and the people on it, I think, are going to be able to share with us incredible innovations they're doing to help get to a zero carbon future. Thank you.
And Cameron, would you also like to take a swing? Why do you think it's so important to reduce emissions? Do you have anything to follow up from Max?
Yeah, for sure. I'm happy to lead on. I think Max did a great job. Also just to kind of illustrate that point Max was making, in the 1800s, the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide was around 280 parts per million. Now it's about 400. So we're looking to double it, which is pretty scary, especially because we don't know what the repercussions are, like Max said, on our supply chain, food access, water security, but also the geopolitical divide that is coming from it right now as well. We're producing the first climate refugees ever, and I feel like that's going to be an increasing trend over the next decade. I'm excited about this. I think primarily, and to be honest, I think my tact has probably changed in the last 5 years. I think I felt very much like this was a losing battle, and I felt like this is kind of like the last hurrah. Now I feel much more inspired working in this domain, and I feel like I feel momentum that I've never felt before, because literally every single person I work with now has conviction on these issues. I'm working with like the smartest people I've ever met in my life, and they're all trying to come up with environmental solutions, new innovative ways of reducing emissions. And so now it's not this deflated kind of feeling. It's like I'm incentivized, I'm motivated, and like I'm seeing the smartest of the smartest working on these challenges. So now like that's why I'm excited about it now, because I feel like we're actually at a point where we can make tangible change, and we got the best coders, some of the best minds on the planet now working on this. So
fantastic. Averey, Christina, do you have anything to add? I'd like to get this to be a bit more of a discussion. Feel free to jump in.
Christina, would you go first? Or?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Averey. Yeah, I think just echoing what Cameron and Max has been saying, in the recent months, we've seen a really rapid uptake of just innovative measure of moving online, for example, even for the largest institutions where, otherwise it will take them decades to move online. All of a sudden, everyone is online. So I think that just proves, how much is possible if there is a resolution, if there is a commitment to doing so. Adopting technology is something that we can do very rapidly. And given that climate change and the global carbon emissions has been skyrocketing, I think we just need to have the same, if not more, level of commitment to curb and to cut down on our carbon emissions in the same way as we have confronted this epidemic.
Yeah, but just to add to that as well, so I think Max told us a bit about what's the effects have been towards countries and businesses, and especially like the food industries that you're seeing the effects from climate change. And I think one of the things that I read was that I think a few years ago, it's about $320 billion US that are spent in losses related to climate change disasters. So these things are becoming much more pressing, much more imminent, and much more demanding of our attention these days. And as I think Christina and also Cameron have mentioned, people are answering that call. So it's definitely a good sign.
Yes, I think particularly exactly as Max started us off with, the food crisis is very significant. I think I also read that crop yield decreases by about 10% per degree of warming. I don't know if you can confirm that, Max, or anyone?
I don't have
not-
the exact scientific numbers on it, so I think Cameron might be able to jump in. I just want to say one, important thing that I think most people have yet to fully consider, which is that the supply of fresh water we have that is largely critical actually to our ability to grow food, to feed ourselves. And just looking at the Asian context, right? A lot of the water we use come from the ice melt from the Himalayas. They sort of flow down both sides. Some would go through Bangladesh and India. The other ones come through China and goes into the Huanghe and Changjiang, basically then runs out all the way to the eastern seaboard. The very pessimistic case is that over the next 20 years, we'll see an accelerated ice melt from the glaciers, and then we'll see flooding along these two parts, right? They're sort of very productive parts of the Chinese riverbed. And after that, we will have drought. And that drought is not going to come, that's not a drought that's going to disappear, because that drought is a systematic lack of water now from the ice accumulation on top of the mountain. And I think there are very few things that threaten the existence of civilization. Famine actually is one of the key things that actually has historically been very good at stopping the existence of civilizations. So that's at least some of the working concepts I have in terms of how this might play out. But yeah, over to you, Cameron.
I think you did a great job. The only point I was going to respond to was yours about crop yield from increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I was just going to explain a little bit about how it's not just that it reduces crop yield, and in some areas it may increase crop yield. Like Canada can produce more barley when it has a little bit of a warmer climate, and extra CO2 sometimes may have a positive effect, but it's like a glacier, right? It's actually probably less than 10%, maybe 1% of the time you can get an improved yield. 90 to 99% of the time it's reducing yield. And it's not just that it reduces the yield of crops, it also makes plants less nutritious. So like the way that carbon dioxide kind of works is that it drives like microbes in the soil to end up securing more nitrogen, phosphate, potassium, and copper, but then it competes with the plant. So it's the microbes now that are feeding off that CO2, they become more aggressive. And so that is actually pretty quantifiable, that even the plants that we are getting from these sites, and even the ones that seem to benefit on the surface, are actually significantly less nutritious overall as well. So yeah, it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, it's scary to think about. And it sort of leads me into our next discussion point, which is what are the most promising approaches to making energy more sustainable? So basically, what can we do from now on to try and reduce our energy demands, or even transition to clean energy? Averey, I thought you'd be a good person to take this on.
Yeah, sure. I think the easy answer for me, coming from a background of renewable energy, is definitely to go for that first. And I think it's come to a really good time, well, not a good time, but it's appropriate now, as we've seen kind of developments in technology, and as I'm sure we'll touch on later, in relation to AI and blockchain, how that has come at a time where this is definitely needed, and how this can be applied in very interesting ways in the energy space. So I think these tools are something that will be very useful as we move forward and try and adopt more renewable energy in the future. And I think in my eyes, that is definitely the most promising way that we can achieve that. I think typically electricity generation is one of the largest factors towards carbon emissions. So I think that could be a very interesting way in how we progress in the future.
Yeah, for sure.
Actually, if I can briefly say, I think, Averey, you should say a few more words. Like, Nephin actually is doing a fantastic job creating huge amounts of infrastructure. I think you should share a bit more details about,
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I was saving the plugs for later, but typically, so we're actually working very hard on that and providing options for companies to construct systems in Hong Kong. So I can't actually say some of the companies that we work with, but For example, we actually have built the largest system in Hong Kong in terms of a solar system, solar PV system. And we work throughout Asia to try and help achieve that, and helping companies to limit their carbon neutrality, limit their carbon emissions, and actually offset what they're doing in other sides of their businesses. And I think that's a very exciting prospect as well, as that we're seeing many of these companies, for example, Bosch is one of these companies, and huge companies like these who are really making an effort to drive towards carbon neutrality and make themselves more responsible in that space as well. Thanks, Max. Yeah.
Christina, I think you also have a lot of experience in this field in terms of serving on the Advisory Council on Environment for Hong Kong. What are your sort of thoughts on it?
Yeah, definitely. I think with the introduction of the feed-in tariff in Hong Kong, there has been a really rapid uptake of domestic kind of rooftop solar, especially given that the government is buying back electricity at a price of 3 to 5 times what people are paying from the grid. So for each kilowatt hour that you generate from your solar panel, you can sell that off at a 3 to 5 times multiple of the electricity that you are buying from the grid. So that presents a huge incentive for people who previously was disengaged, disinterested, to now considering about adopting solar on their rooftop. And I think the number of application has recently exceeded 10,000 just in Hong Kong alone. And of course, these are like a lot smaller than I think what Averey, your utility size PV projects are. But I think it shows from the mass market level, there has been a very big interest to adopt clean energy. And I think when we talk about achieving carbon neutrality, in addition to supplying clean energy, it's as important to think about our energy usage, our energy loading. And that has been, I think, a lot harder because energy is an abstract concept. For renewable energy, you can see the infrastructure, like panels, wind turbines, but when it's being consumed, it's actually translated into different kinds of services: cooling load, heating load, your monitoring, your internet right now. And it's a lot harder for people to understand where energy has been used. So the other side of that is how do we engage and educate people so that they become a citizen, not only consuming, but in stewarding and safeguarding the resources that they use, especially in business setting, commercial settings, because that's where in Hong Kong, most of the energy is used, not in the residential sector, but in really the commercial sector. So I think it's as important to think about the equation in both sides, clean energy supply on the supply side and optimizing energy usage in the demand side. And there's been a lot of technologies to do so, including load shading program with utility companies and in commercial levels, different kinds of demand response program, and on an individual level, doing peer comparison, providing people with data so that they can actually act on improving their own energy footprint.
Do you think you could recommend any services to our audience for anyone that wants to reduce their own footprints?
Well, I have to declare my conflict of interest because our company works on that area of giving people ownership and transparency over their own energy usage. So yeah, if you guys are interested, please feel free to ping me. And I'm open to refer you to open source and other kinds of services as well. But the reason why we started this company called Blue Sky is because we've seen the data points of how energy is the major cause of carbon emission in Hong Kong. Building electricity usage accounts directly for nearly 70% of our city's carbon emission. And yet day in and day out, when we ask, a well-educated audience, maybe as simply as this audience, how much electricity have you used today? in your home or in your office. I mean, less than 1% of people can tell you. And if we ask, oh, do you know what 1 kilowatt hour means? How many units of AC, air conditioning unit, can it power up for how many hours? Scarcely anyone can tell you that. But that is the exact cause of what's causing our global carbon crisis. And so there's just this massive gap of bridging people's understanding and empowering them with knowledge and transparency to cut down on their usage.
Fantastic. I think that's another great lead-in to our next point is what are the challenges in the transition to more sustainable practices? Cameron, you've done a lot of work sort of globally with different governments, and sort of what do you feel like is the pushback that is stopping not just governments but people as well from becoming more sustainable?
Traditionally, I think it's been two things. I think it's been the economics, and I think it's been risk tolerance. So I think utilities and commercial enterprises have been a little wary of, if we're going to talk strictly about renewables, I think they've been a little tepid about that technology because there's the intermittency aspect, right? Renewables are not operating 24/7, and they were previously seen as risky investments. Like in Canada, back in 2005, I think 0.2% of our entire electricity portfolio came from wind and solar. In less than 10 years, that climbed over 25 times. And that's largely because I think actually of Chinese investment in solar and in wind production. So China is now the #1 global producer of wind turbines and solar panels. That radically helped improve the reliability of these sources of energy, but also the predictability as well, and also the cost. There's an interesting law in energy called Swanson's law. It basically means every time you double the global capacity of solar panels, you reduce the cost by 20%, and that's definitely been what's been observed with solar panels. You can think of it the same way you would think of a computer, right? Your Macintosh. I think the biggest challenges now are probably more related to attitude than anything. That may seem a little pedantic, but I actually believe that's the case. Because like I could break down, like technically we have challenges related to grid integration, we have challenges with intermittency, but we're making huge advancements in energy storage right now, whether it's compressed air storage, battery storage, lithium storage. Like we're making radical advancements in these technologies. I feel very optimistic that all of the technical hurdles can be overcome. It's now an attitudinal change, right? We didn't think we'd be able to get the economics of renewables to where they are now in a 10-year period. And I think we know that technically we can achieve that type of full grid integration globally. It's just a matter of I think, getting enough people on board and maybe kind of getting rid of a bit of a legacy mindset. So, I mean, that's what I'm excited about for sure. But yeah, I think it's more of an attitude and mindset and probably just like a little bit of like clawing back from the incumbent industry. Every time one dominant industry player is kind of losing its footing, it's going to push back twice as hard. I think that happened a lot in the last 10 years, trying to disparage clean tech. But I think they're losing their footing. So yeah, I would say that's probably the main challenge right now, but not one that can't be overcome.
Do you mind if I add on to that, by the way, just quickly? So yeah, thanks for your points, Cameron. And definitely attitude is a very key thing.
You are mute.
Sorry about that. What we really need right now, like on top of what the attitude will bring us, and I think that's a stepping stone, is we need like the market frameworks and like the legal framework as well as the infrastructure and understanding of that in order to actually implement these things. So I mean, you mentioned things about China having all of this wind and solar implementation, which is great, of course, but there's obviously when you have that kind of rapid increase in renewable penetration, you need to also have the infrastructure there to actually assist that. So I think one of the key issues you get in many places in China is a lot of curtailment. So you're losing a lot of this energy, even though we have the solar there. So it's that understanding and that market and legal framework which will bring that along as well. I think that's a very key challenge.
I think that's a really good point. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on like maybe some of the grid integration challenges that are being experienced in China, because I think for a lot of the people that are on this panel, they maybe don't understand the nature of renewables, not just the fact that it's intermittent, but also the fact that it isn't concentrated, right? It's not isolated to any one area. So you have to retrofy a grid so that it can incorporate kind of distributed generation. That is definitely a challenge.
Yeah,
I think it would be great for you to actually kind of speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, we need to just distinguish between, I think the ones that we talk about with these huge installations, they are very much centralized. These are huge solar power plants on the gigawatt scale. So it ends up being a very different beast entirely to when you're considering distributed generation, which is typically what like we kind of deal with, especially in Hong Kong, as Christina mentioned. A lot of these things are very small residential systems, right? Completely different scale to the ones we're talking about over like massive plains, and you have these solar systems there. So I mean, the infrastructure you need for that is very different. So typically when you're talking about these, the thing is with these large solar plants, it's actually not too much of an issue in terms of infrastructure once you've built it, because it's very much the same as what was happened before. Our current systems, they're built on this very traditional idea of you have the generation in one place and you bring it to the city centers where that's used. However, that has very much changed when we start considering distributed generation, and you think about consumers also being producers of energy. And with that, we need to think about the technology, the differences in the infrastructure side as well that we need to consider as we implement that. And those are all very difficult to manage. Typically with the amount of data that we need to manage, security, the market forces, the legal framework. I think only some countries have implemented peer-to-peer trading of energy. For example, in Australia, the UK, the US, Netherlands, they have this stuff in place. But I think in Asia in particular, all this is quite new, and implementing that kind of legal framework is quite difficult, and kind of understanding all the nuance and challenge behind that. So I think Malaysia actually has a very recent pilot project working on peer-to-peer trading, which is quite exciting as well. Yeah.
No. You can keep speaking.
Yeah, so I actually wanted to mention that another interesting point is about carbon credits and this kind of tokenization of assets as well, which I think Max could also add on, because I think that's his area of expertise. Cameron, I think you had a question as well. So. Or a comment.
Well, I don't mean to dominate this conversation. I was going to give an example of exactly what you're describing that we're experiencing in Canada, and how it kind of ties back to the attitude thing, I think, as well. We have, so with residential installations of renewable energy, like you said, Averey, it's very different to centralized kind of gen, right? When we have these really large projects taking up acres and acres of land. But when you're just putting solar panels or a wind turbine on a house, you need to have bi-directional metering. You got to have a two-way kind of grid. So basically you can send electricity to the grid, or you can pull it off, but you need to have utility companies that are, first of all, willing to do that. And second, it really, really helps the technology if you have incentives from government, like a feed-in tariff that will provide you extra monetary value when they're actually buying electricity, solar electricity from you on your house. The attitude issue comes in with politics. So we had 4 years with the government that rolled out these programs where they incentivize people to put solar panels on the roof and feed it into the grid. New government in my previous province, I won't name it, got rid of that policy. And so now all of these houses are kind of stranded, because if they're selling electricity to the grid, they're not doing it at that kind of improved rate. So the economics kind of hurt for them, and they don't have utility companies that are as willing to kind of engage with them on that. And so I think that kind of consistency also needs to be there as well. It is a challenge, but that also comes down to people at the end of the day too. Like who do you have kind of running these programs? So anyways, I'll let you go, Max.
I'm really appreciating this lively discussion. I think one thing to call out, and this is something that I was just doing a bit of research before this, is actually the way that renewable energy is recognized by the grid. So unlike many other things, when you actually feed power into the grid, like coal electricity and solar electricity look the same. They all end up being electricity. So what people have come up with is this idea of a REC, a renewable energy certificate, that demarcates the existence of electricity as actually being sustainably produced versus fire produced. And I was just reading, there's some great statistics about the curve of REC market growth over the last few years. There was a statistic somewhere in 2016 that said that in the United States, where the REC market was originally sort of described, there was about, this is in 2016, right? So it's many years ago. Unfortunately, under the Trump administration, they have not been very concerned about renewable energy at all. So some of the numbers actually are not very well documented in the last few years. There were about 95 million megawatts of green power in 2016. And that accounts for about 28% of all US renewable energy sales, excluding large hydropower. So what is really cool to me is the fact that companies now have joined, there's one particular organization called RE100. And RE100 means that the companies who join RE100 pledge to use only 100% renewable energy. That's sort of their equivalent of being carbon neutral, but on the green energy side. And the way you do that is either you buy green electricity, so electricity that actually comes from directly a renewable source, or you buy regular electricity and you pay a premium to buy RECs to count against your electricity. And REC prices have fluctuated between 50 cents to $1 per megawatt hour. So if we look at the history of this price market in recent times, I think it was looking at something like it was about 2 million 2 million megawatt hours actually in March 2020, and that's actually at the global development level. So I think if my numbers add up correctly, that it should be about $2 billion in REC market activity. And that's, a pretty meaningful number. It's not huge in terms of power as a GDP numbers is trillions of dollars. But I think that what we're starting to see is actually a market incentive for people who generate green energy to be able to monetize not only directly into the grid locally, but also internationally, people can come and purchase these RECs. The other thing I want to just briefly say in regards to sort of peer-to-peer is I think the world as a whole is moving from a place of centralized control into more decentralized control. And one of the key reasons of that is that technology is making each section of society a lot smarter than it used to be. So it used to be that you couldn't see all the data, so you didn't necessarily know how to optimize your local community. Now actually we have the cost is marginally free. Programming is actually a very ready resource in many parts of the world. And with Accelerate, teaching more programmers, I think hopefully we continue to disseminate that. What I want to say is that I think peer-to-peer energy is going to be one of the key things that we'll see in the near future. Because unlike trying to convince the central authority that runs the state grid to take in your green electricity or even to implement feed-in tariffs, these are very, very expensive, high energy barrier to activation mountains to climb. Like the fact that you can actually have your green electricity be used and consumed by your local community is a much easier proposition. And so I would love to encourage everyone to sort of think about that in your local context, and actually if you can monetize and also feed green electricity, then I think that's actually each of us being able to take individual action for climate change.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Max. And just to bring the scope down to more of a local level, if we start focusing back on Hong Kong and we look at what I want to ask you guys is, what do you think can be done by Hong Kong to enforce the transition to green energy, sustainability practices? Are we talking about them, sort of pushing forth more regulation to take on things like carbon credits to encourage more solar, or should they be focusing on, as one of our listeners has asked, should they be focusing on trying to change the attitude from top down to try and get more people in Hong Kong aware of what's going on? Christina, I thought you could take this.
Sure, I'll start us off, but I'm sure the panelists have been brilliant, and I'm very excited to hear everyone's input. I think there definitely needs to be an all hands in kind of collaboration way to make this work. Max has touched upon the important role of financial. So financing, making these clean energy into investable resources, so that people who have, let's say, rooftop, who have pieces of lands, for example, can invest in solar panels because there is a financing mechanism to back that up. And also like increasing collaborations across the region, so that in Hong Kong, even if we don't have land masses, we can import different kinds of new type of energy. And I think what's really interesting is when we talk about the new type of energy, we previously really think about, wind turbine, solar energy, and different kinds of like geothermal, which is limited geographically. Because when you think about the demand of energy, it's very much concentrated in dense populated cities or pockets of heavy industrialization regions. And these places are known to be very packed, and it's hard to find land for these huge kinds of land masses or coastal areas that's ideal for renewable energy. And what's really exciting is there have been new types of storage, transportation means of renewable energy that are more and more easily available. And one of it is hydrogen. So storing renewable energy as hydrogen fuel and transporting them, just like how we transport petroleum these days, are increasingly more and more technologically viable. And so with that, it basically opens up the world to compensate each other, where pockets of clean energy generated by solar can now be transported across oceans or even across huge land masses without losing a lot of its efficiency. And so I think top-down level-wise, we definitely need more regional collaborations, more top-down policies to look far ahead in future. The thing about energy is when we build a power plant, let's say a coal-fired power plant or a nuclear power plant, they will be around for at least 20 or 30 years. So we're talking about a decision that we make for the next 20 or 30 years. So we definitely need top-level commitment to make advanced technology investment instead of sticking to our old ways. And then we're stuck with that for the next 20 or 30 years. So I think it's extremely important for top-level government officials, company financiers to back up latest technology and really invest in clean type of energy, and as well as different transportation means of these new type of energy, so that what was previously impossible will be made possible. So I think that's the first one. And the second thing that I think is extremely important is everyone's participation. Really echoing what Cameron has talked about is our attitude. Everyone plays a part. Like, who in the audience has not used energy today? It means that you haven't turned on a single light, you haven't used your laptop, or you haven't used the elevator, or and it's impossible for us not to use energy. So if we are an energy user, then we each can make a decision to change the way of how we want energy to look like. And so that involves us being a responsible steward in making proactive decisions. For example, if the AC if the air conditioning in your own apartment or flat is already cold enough, then you can actually shut it down for a while and use your electricity fan, or you can actually turn up 1 degree Celsius, because by turning up 1 degree Celsius of your AC, you actually save about 5% overall on your energy bill. So if everyone can take that step of behavioral change, when the AC is cold enough, you don't put on extra layers of jacket, but you will actually, oh, I would just wear a t-shirt, you know. So those type of behavioral changes, we should definitely encourage more in Hong Kong offices. As you can observe in most Hong Kong offices, people put on layers of jackets and cardigans, while the AC is set at, I don't know, like 19 degrees Celsius at point. And that's crazy, because air conditioning is simply a heat exchanger. What it means is it's throwing the heat out inside your buildings to the street. So it's actually creating inequality, because a lot of people, for example, laborers or people who need to work outside, you know, they don't have the luxury staying inside the building. So if we're turning up the AC because we can pay for it, or because we don't pay for it, is actually creating a huge inequality for people who can not afford, you know, being comfortable inside a building. And so when we talk about saving energy and being a responsible steward of our resources, that's what we need to have in our attitude, is a moral issue. It's not a far-fetched, you know, a century kind of crisis that will happen in the next 100 years. It's no, I'm going to make my neighbor, the person selling newspaper down the road, hotter if I blast my AC. That's kind of the moral attitudinal change that we need to see in everyone's behavior. And I think that's not something that the government can do, but it's something that each of us can step up and do.
Brilliant. And I think to jump on your point about ACs in Hong Kong and about the significant contribution to energy in Hong Kong, I think, as someone said earlier, I think buildings make up something like 90% of our electricity usage, and AC is an enormous part of that. What are some of the ways we can make buildings more energy efficient? And obviously, some of those ways are by using renewables, but are there any fundamental ways we can retrofit old buildings to make them use less energy, aside from just turning down the AC? I guess, Max, would you like to take this one?
I would say that I'm not a building development expert, so I would defer to any other people on the panel for this particular thing. Something I've been thinking a lot about actually is the way that energy is consumed and also used, produced and used inside cities. By and large, we have actually largely concentrated all of human populations in these very dense urban clusters. And then we have very large pieces of agricultural land and other usage. Especially during COVID, we've seen that supply chains, like international level supply chains, don't actually work super well anymore. Especially, it's like we sort of see breakdowns. So if we can actually encourage a lot more local energy generation in the clusters of urban centers where we have, rooftop solar, I think is the most visible one. But I think even at a more grander scale, if we can actually design buildings that the entire building is actually covered with solar panels as opposed to just the very small piece of area on the top, I think that could be a way to reimagine how we use urban space. And just even extrapolate a little bit more broad, like I think where we see human concentration of life today, we actually see destruction of the natural living environment. And Hong Kong is really unique because for many people who are coming from New York or London, they're surprised to see that so much lush life, like so much nature actually next to the urban centers. I think it'd be really interesting if we set a precedent where the more that people actually concentrate in an area, the wealthier it becomes, the more vibrant the natural ecosystem is around that area. Like if we actually started making that the way that we design cityscapes, I think that actually would set, would dramatically transform how people, thought about what they want to build and what luxury means. So I think that's an opportunity where I think we just have to rethink many things that we take for granted. Like so much of what we accept as, you know, valuable, as precious, as treasured, like none of those things are sustainable, and none of those things are even that, frankly, that interesting. And I think we're sort of at a beginning place of actually redefining what value means, and hopefully we define it with a lot more natural capital inside.
I think especially when you look to places like Singapore, where they've got, you know, Hong Kong's very green, but that's a lot to do with sort of the natural parks we have and the areas that we frankly can't actually build on. But if anyone's ever been to Singapore, you actually find greenery is sort of embedded into the heart of the city. You know, you've got trees and gardens hanging from buildings or half the way up buildings, and that's something that Hong Kong doesn't quite have. Averey, I'd sort of want to pass the discussion point to you on how buildings can be more energy efficient, just from your own expertise in sort of renewable energy and installing these systems for buildings.
Well, yeah, I can definitely add my comments on this, although I do believe Christina would be the expert in terms of building efficiency. But I definitely, I mean, I would add on to the points made by Max in the sense that rooftop or built-in PV can be very good ways in which you can make things more efficient. One of the benefits of solar as well is that it can actually shield and limit some of the solar, like heat you get from the sun into some of these buildings. So that can be a benefit that you can actually get from solar as well. But realistically, it's a lot about HVAC. Yeah, as you said, it's about air conditioning and having these systems which allow for efficient cooling of the entire building, which I think is a very key issue in Hong Kong, given like our temperature is like even now pretty bad. So I think it's very easy, much easier to talk about this when you're talking about new buildings, and you have all these certifications with new construction of buildings and sustainable architecture, where you can actually incorporate all this greenery and do that. But I think the key question for Hong Kong, and one of the key difficulties, is all of this infrastructure that's already here, and how we can actually improve these systems, retrofitting them in a way that is not, first of all, not disruptive, not too high cost, and is also something that people are willing to do as well. Because I think there's a lot, especially in a local community, there isn't that awareness or drive, especially amongst the older generation. This is very much a privileged, I guess it's a privileged awareness. So I think this comes back to Cameron's point about how this needs to be spread out to people, I mean, beyond class, education, and also age as well. Because I think those are key things that separate people who know about renewable energy or know about carbon neutrality and people who are driving towards it.
Thank you very much. And Christina, I thought you could probably give the final word on this discussion topic. Provide your expertise in the matter.
Not my expertise, but I'm really passionate about this. And I think the one biggest opportunity to save on AC cost, especially for the audience at your home, is to add an electricity fan to your home. So instead of just turning on your air conditioning, turn on the electricity fan as well. And you'll feel a lot cooler, a lot more comfortable, while you can, turn up your AC by maybe 1 or even 2 or 3 degrees Celsius once the whole space is cooled down. Because what it helps is it brings the cool air well ventilated throughout the whole space, but using only about 5% of what an AC uses. So what that means, if you install 20 fans in your home, is equal to 1 of your AC unit only in a typical family unit. So that's the one biggest lowest hanging fruit that everyone can do to dramatically reduce AC costs while increasing your comfort. The second area that has been overlooked a lot is in cleaning up your AC filter. Because in Hong Kong, with the dusty environment, the filters get clogged very easily. And it also becomes a bed of different bacteria and virus growth. So with the importance of health these days, is very good practice to at least clean up your filter regularly, at least once a quarter, to prevent the AC from overheating or overuse and powering it up. I would say in the commercial building side, the importance is to use passive design in building. So what a passive design means is to avoid trapping and containing cooling load within a building. And how that works is, and Averey has pointed out to that, is use different means to block the building from gaining heat load. That includes, installing solar panels as the shade, or tilting the orientation of the building so that it doesn't face the direct summer heat with the angles, because the summer sun is of a higher angle than the winter. So if you can shade and put facade that can actually block off the summer heat, that will really help. And one aspect that has been hugely overlooked, and I think Hong Kong has been trying more of that, is to create natural ventilation corridor. Instead of spacing buildings close back to back towards each other, create natural ventilation corridors so that buildings actually doesn't need to be mechanically ventilated when the weather is ideal outside. Meaning that if people have a choice to actually open windows, there will be fresh breeze and fresh air that can be flown through the building, with maybe installation of some filters that help with the air quality. So there are many measures that we can do, not only to save energy, but actually to improve the comfort level and the healthiness of the indoor environment as well. So I think that's a topic that I hope everyone will be, a voice to advocate on. If you have a chance to redesign your home, buy new appliances, or to influence how a new building is being constructed or retrofitted, I think these are all important parameters to consider.
Brilliant. And just to sort of move on the discussion a little bit, I want to sort of start talking a little bit about AI. And I know, Max, that's one of your areas of expertise, but I sort of want to bring Cameron back into this discussion. Cameron, I know you're sort of working on potential education programs that look into optimizing AI with some of the programs that you already currently do about teaching people about delivering renewable systems. What do you think are some of the potential applications of AI in the future, and how might that affect the world?
You know what? I have a perfect segue from that last conversation, actually. One of probably the coolest applications I've seen of energy efficiency and AI, especially with buildings becoming a little bit more efficient, is with the use of IoT, or Internet of Things. I don't know, so I've never been to Hong Kong, but are you familiar with the Hong Kong building? Hong Kong Club. It's a building in Hong Kong. I was studying it last year. So they ruled out a little bit of an initiative with this kind of Internet of Things application that basically looks at your HVAC systems, as Averey had mentioned. And what it will do is, based on the time of day, it will use AI and IoT to assess, okay, what's the lighting that's going to be coming in the building? It also has sensors to detect lighting, opens up the blinds, allows for natural lighting. It has it on the roof as well. If your building is getting to a little hot, it automatically will open windows, and over time it incorporates artificial intelligence to actually allow for that natural draft to come through, natural lighting to come through. It was a really, I think, a bit of an ambitious tech kind of accomplishment, but guess how much it saved for them annually? It was $1 million. $1 million. So like fiscally, it made a ton of sense. It saved them the investment, I think, like multiple times over, and amounted in like an energy use reduction of almost 15%. That's in Hong Kong. So that's a perfect application, I think, of AI for building efficiency. Another application too, one that Levine and I have kind of spoke about, and potentially talking about building a course on, is using AI to assess the kind of energy output of renewable energy projects. So determining what your energy production will be from a site, it is a little difficult to get it 100% accurate, but artificial intelligence now is like making leaps and gains in our ability to predict energy outputs from particular sites, which is great for companies that are going to make large capital investments. It's great for utility companies that are managing the grid, the distribution of electricity on lines, knowing when solar photovoltaics are going to produce energy, exactly how much they're going to be feeding into the grid. Exact same thing with wind. AI, having that machine learning where it can begin to predict that with greater and greater accuracy and consistency, I think that is going to make all of the difference. And that is actually now being, I think, focused on quite heavily, not just because it's important for the environment, but now it's important for the economics. And if the economics make sense, then the technology is going to stand no matter what the political appetite is regarding the environment or the climate. So that's one thing I'm very excited about, both one in terms of producing reliable forecasts of energy output. AI is going to be integral to that. And then also using AI and the Internet of Things to build energy efficiency, especially with HVAC systems.
Absolutely. Could I add to that just there? Because this is definitely touching on some very key points
Please.
that I would love to touch on. So what we talked about before, like with the traditional energy space, you know, it's a very asset-heavy industry, right? The way that one very key thing that people want is they want flexibility. You want power whenever you want it. You don't want to have to go to your plug and suddenly you don't have any power left, you know? And that's what can happen with solar. As you've said, you need to predict when it's going to come. So in the past, that was very asset-heavy. But because of the cost of these things, you know, people have said the cost of wind, solar, batteries in particular are so expensive that we want to go towards using technology to help us become more flexible and flexible without being asset heavy. And we can optimize these assets. So really that AI is going to help to, I mean, you've touched on predicting generation, but really you should predict a lot of different things. Generation, which is difficult because you need to consider the weather, which is in itself a difficult thing to consider. Cloud cover immediately changes solar generation. It's a very difficult task. You need to predict demand, what your customer is going to, what the person is going to use. You know, suddenly if they want to use more power, then it becomes very difficult to predict that. And also in terms of, in some markets, if you're looking at Australia in particular, about the price of electricity, because that changes on 15-minute, 30-minute intervals. So you have three different, very, very difficult variables to predict. And the people who are able to tap into that and actually use AI and machine learning, which is, I mean, this may not be the only way, but it seems like the best way that we have now to predict these things, will be the people who crack renewable energy and carbon neutrality.
Max, would you like to add a little bit more about sort of the AI aspects that you're
Yeah,
currently
well, I was going to say, I think maybe Christina should speak a little bit before I do. We actually were talking a few weeks ago, and you know, I think Blue Sky actually has been pioneering a lot of the demand prediction stuff happening in Hong Kong. So I'd love to give her the floor before I sort of share my thoughts.
Wow, thanks, Max. You are the data person in our group, so I can just share a bit, but love to hear you. What we've been doing is we incorporate the weather forecast from Hong Kong Observatory, and we learn the pattern of our users' historical energy usage, looking at different times of the day. Let's say if it's a Monday or a Tuesday or Wednesday, or if it's a Saturday, Sunday. If it's an academic institution, we also learn the calendar. So whether it's a spring break, whether it's the exam season, etc. And so over time, this model learns the pattern of the correlation, given different temperature, given different academic calendar, different months of the year, and given this type of building, be it academic or commercial or residential, what is a reasonable energy usage for this particular hour, given a particular day of a particular temperature. And so we give them a general budget, which is reasonable based on all these historical parameters. And if they exceed the threshold, then we provide them with a heads up, as in, oh, you know, your usage is above what we have reasonably predict, maybe it's time for you to look into this particular zone or this particular appliance. Because we do granular monitoring, meaning that we break down the energy usage by particular appliance, air conditioning versus lighting versus socket in different rooms or different floor areas. So the data points that we recommend back to the users is very particular of a particular appliance or an area, so that it's actionable for them. It also like frees up their manual effort to kind of like review their energy bill after a month without knowing where or why it has gone up, or where and why is the saving effort that they can continue and repeat throughout the rest of the organizations. So that's kind of the prediction model that we've built over the past few years. That is actually user-centric, because we use that to remind end user, given the huge variation of energy usage pattern. If we set one figure without changing it, we simply can't provide that service of reminding people 24/7 around the clock. So that has been one of the major model that we use to help us to serve our clients to achieve energy saving. And yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts, Max, because you have done a lot of work in data science and data analytics.
Yeah, so I personally used to be a data scientist in California. I was doing a lot of time series data sets. So I had to build predictive models for time series in finance and in some other sectors as well. I think where we are going with machine learning is really the ability to make every facet of the consumption smarter. And right now, just to sort of touch on briefly what Cameron was saying, right now, a lot of our devices, they consume, with very little input from us, and they turn on and off with very little guidance. The fact that Google has bought Nest for such an expensive amount for just this smart, for just a relatively not that smart thermometer, I think, for a house, says to me that that's actually the beginning of the next section of actually section of appliance building, which actually is to make every single thing in our house smart, and also talk to each other. And I kind of believe that where we will see is not AI in the sort of monolithic sense. What we'll start to see is actually distributed intelligence. Intelligence actually pushed to the boundaries of all of the places where it needs to happen, and then is able to make edge decisions as opposed to centralized grid decisions. As an interesting sort of anecdote, someone also mentioned to me the carbon footprint of one of Google's AI models, and they put that in comparison to relative other things we know about flying and cars and all this stuff, and it is off the sheet. It is way larger in energy consumption than anything else that we think about industrial scale wise. So I think, how do we make AI machine learning more energy efficient also is kind of an interesting topic, using it maybe some algorithms themselves. An interesting additional development happening recently in neural network and deep learning is actually this idea of transfer learning. So what's really expensive about the process of actually training algorithms is actually to train a model from scratch, right? You actually need to feed it billions of data points, and it takes supercomputers to train it. But if you have a trained model and you want to adjust its purpose to distinguish from being like a face recognition for humans to face recognition for cats, you actually just need to train one layer of the final decision tree, final decision network, and that actually is way more economic. So as people build these machine learning algorithms, there's actually ways to intelligently optimize where you want to spend your time training in order to achieve much more cost conservative and energy consumption places. I also want to, I guess, touch on the idea of smart cities, and everyone's been talking about smart cities. It's a topical idea right now. But last year I had a chance to visit Alibaba's cloud computing center, and as many people know, Alibaba is the largest cloud provider in China. It's about 50% market share. And I was talking to this gentleman who works for their efforts, and they said, now that we've actually serviced a lot of the small, medium-sized companies, we need to find problems that are big enough for our computers to actually work on. Right? It's not enough just to sort of serve the regular use case anymore. So they're trying to put the entire city of Hangzhou on the cloud. And it is absolutely breathtaking. Hangzhou City generates about 250 petabytes of data a day. I forget how many petabytes is the internet, but it's like on the same order of magnitude, in terms of like how much information there exists there. And I think the ability for us to take these macroscopic views of entire cityscapes and actually do what Christina was mentioning, being able to find the slight tweaks that you can shave off 1, 2, 3% in the city, I think is actually going to be the way that we start to reduce energy at scale using the tools of AI.
Brilliant. And I think that'll be particularly important for Hong Kong in the future, being as it's quite a small space. It's one of the best ways it could look at its energy footprint is by optimizing all these small things about the city as it goes around, whether it be energy efficiency, whether it be just sort of the day-to-day activities of people that you just kind of nudge in the right directions. But if we were to look at some of the renewable sources that might be available for Hong Kong, I know there's been talk about things like floating PV on one of the dams, because frankly, Hong Kong doesn't actually have a sufficient amount of space for renewables. I was wondering what everyone's impressions are. Is that sort of a fallacy? Is there actually plenty that Hong Kong can do with renewables, such as offshore wind farms and things like that? Or are we just going to have to rely on cutting down our energy load effectively? Averey, I thought you'd be good to take this.
Yeah, so I think, so I think I wouldn't say that we still have a long way to go in terms of Hong Kong, in terms of what we can implement. I think right now we have about 5 megawatts of let's say solar in itself first, and about half that in wind. But realistically, I think some of the studies I've read is that the amount of solar that we could install is on the order of magnitude of about 500 megawatts in terms of solar in Hong Kong. On the other hand, we also have wind, where there's actually been 2 sites identified of offshore wind farms, which add up to about 300 megawatts. There's a lot to be done. And I think the key thing here is actually making that commercially viable. I think the cost of the offshore wind farms would be in excess of 10 billion Hong Kong dollars, which is a good amount of money for accounting for such a small amount of energy, if you compare it to the cost that you would get from using natural gas or coal, which are the main ones that we use in Hong Kong. So right now, I think it's 25% natural gas, no, so 25% coal, 50% natural gas, and then 25% non-fossil fuel, which actually is a lot of nuclear from China. But really, the key thing here is we have the space, we have the tech. It's about making these commercial side work. I think Cameron also touched on that as well, because once it's commercially feasible, doesn't matter what the politics are, people will do it. So that's also something that NEFIN also works on. We help to finance projects and helps people to, if they have the roof space, and we can actually finance projects as well. And I think it's a matter of having these financiers who can help that along the process and help clients see this as we can take the risk off clients. So they don't have to bear the risk. They don't have to bear the initial costs. I think that could be very exciting for spurring that on as a project. And I think that touches on one of your earlier comments asking about what Hong Kong can do in general. And I think Christina also mentioned how financiers is a key part, and financing in general is a key part of spurring that on in the future. But I definitely think we do have space. I think that's a key point.
Christina, would you mind sort of following up a little bit, maybe touching on what the current status quo is in Hong Kong? Obviously, we have the space to develop a lot of these energy projects, but what's sort of the government's kind of feedback? What's their kind of direction? Are they looking to transform Hong Kong into being more sustainable in terms of energy efficient, in terms of sustainable energy, or are they looking at other methods?
Definitely, Hong Kong as a part, it might not be very well known, but the Hong Kong government has recently done a citywide consultancy engagement, asking everyone to provide their input on how, what will be the decarbonization strategy of Hong Kong as a city, and looking as far ahead into 2050. And so that is a major effort for Hong Kong to develop not only like a silo, but a multi-pronged approach, touching on everything from your clothing to the food that you eat, to transportation, to your building, residential, housing type of transportation. So it's a multi-pronged citywide consultancy approach. And so with that, there has been a lot of discussion around how can we create a city that actually with different kind of departments talking to each other instead of like working in silo. And so we've seen some policies, for example, electric vehicles, enjoying certain subsidies versus traditional, combustion and fuel types of vehicle. So I think that has been some good progress. I think the difficulty is there's definitely political constraints, and the atmosphere is not conducive to the government putting out some advanced or aggressive measures. But I think what's encouraging is we've been also seeing a lot of younger generations having consent around the fact that this is an issue that we want to work on collectively. So it's hard to have a consent these days, but this is one of the topics where there is consent. So I think there's definitely hope in this topic.
And Cameron, just from your experience kind of in sort of Canada and abroad, what do you think is the sort of the potential for sort of the Hong Kong government and the status quo here to kind of change? You talked a little bit about financials, and when the financials make sense, the rest will follow. Can you think of any specific things that Hong Kong might personally benefit from? I think you muted.
I'll be honest. I think my my understanding of the Hong Kong both natural environment and kind of economy will be dwarfed by the rest of the panel here. So I don't mean to detract from them at all. I definitely want to give them the platform to speak to it. All I can say is, like, even yesterday in advance of this, I was reading a report from WWF, and it said. So they did a survey of Hong Kong residents looking to see what even the appetite would be for an increase in tariffs on electricity to incent more renewables. And they found, I think it was between 60 and 70% of respondents, and it was a random study, said that they would be willing to take a 5% increase on their electricity tariffs to incent more renewables. So it sounds like with the public, the appetite is there. I know that China is a very bold country. It's one that is very willing to take risks and plan at least, like China is the only country I know that actually has 100-year plans for economic development, which is pretty encouraging. I think that's the reason why renewables have got the investment in China that they have. And I think even with tree planting, which is my other business, I know China has invested, I think, like $64 billion into planting trees in northern China in the last few decades. So the country is now making a lot of gains. Hong Kong in particular, it seems like there's a greater palette for change within the general public. So I'm encouraged by it. In terms of the actual environment and technologies that are best suited for that city, I definitely would want to give the floor to Max, Averey, and Christina. But I feel optimistic about what kind of comes out of that foresight and strategic planning that I've been observing there.
Sure. Does anyone want to take Cameron up on this one?
Yeah, I think that was a very good point, Cameron, and thank you for that. I think the attitude is definitely there. But one thing I must say that is, as we go forward with policies, I think it's very important to consider how they might interplay and how pushing forward one type of technology may actually inhibit others. So one example that I do have is right now we have this very strong feed-in tariff. And from my knowledge, it is the highest in the world at the moment for solar. For renewable energy in general. So the issue here is that because the feed-in tariff is so high, it's actually inhibited any commercial gain from installing batteries in Hong Kong. Because obviously, if you can just sell it off to the grid, you don't have to store it, and you actually make a lot more than storing it yourself. Add that to the cost of batteries, and you end up there's no real reason for it in Hong Kong. So we have this feed-in tariff policy, which is lasting until 2033. But I think it's important for us to think about the sustainability of that. So what happens when these things stop? So last time we had, I think it was in 2009, we had the big solar crash because in Europe, many of the European countries, they shut down the feed-in tariff. And that meant that a lot of these businesses suddenly shut down. There was bankruptcy for solar companies. Edison Solar was a large company that shut down. And I think many other companies grew out of that. But it's important to think about how these policies will develop over time, how that might affect other types of technologies, and whether they're sustainable in the long run afterwards. I think something that we definitely consider.
Great. Go for it, Max.
So one quick sentence here. I think Hong Kong is actually in a very unique place because it is a financial center. And I think that the key problem of climate change cannot be solved without smart and creative financing. And I think as Hong Kong sort of thinks about what the future of the city could do, right, especially in international context, I think the unifying thing is, to find a place where Hong Kong can provide leadership and value in an international scale, drawing from its proximity to China as well as its multicultural roots to the rest of the world. And so one of the things I'm really excited to see more of, and something I've been personally trying to be involved in, is actually the design of green finance policies in Hong Kong. There is a project underway. My former thesis advisor, actually from the master's program, is now leading a research effort in Hong Kong, trying to interview large financial groups and stakeholders about what policies they would like to see to actually encourage more of that market growth in the local context. And then I think also for both the renewable energy certificate market, the general carbon offset compliance market, which is China also planned to launch at the end of this year, there are new types of financial instruments that actually directly correlates to the positive activity of something that is good for the climate. And as more of these things become real, tangible, and also receive investment attention, I think we'll see a sort of surge of additional institutional capital into this space. A lot of people, I think, right now care about climate change, but they don't really have a direct means of taking action. And so if we can provide people with a means of making more money for themselves, and also having their money be used to things that actually help improve the environment, I think that's something we can all stand to benefit from. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Max. I think we'll start to wrap up soon, and I'm going to put questions out from the audience. If anyone wants to ask any questions to our panelists, please write them down in the chat. There's been a few already, so I'll just quickly go over them. Christina, you were quickly asked about I know you've already replied in the chat, but you were asked a little bit more about the public engagement study and how ready citizens are to make changes. Do you know anything about that yourself, or can you add any more details?
Yeah, I think everyone is really excited to hear back on the result, on what is the result that the university research team can come up with. So I think I myself are also really excited and looking forward to the results. But I think what we have seen is there has been a lot of responses, responses that were unparalleled to previous kinds of engagement. So I think there's just a lot of interest from the public on this topic, which is good, because we don't want to see a lukewarm, oh, there's no response. I think a lot of responses are a good indicator that, this is a topic that more and more people pay attention to and would like to see more on this.
Great. I would encourage everyone, if anyone's got any questions, please pop them right in the chat and we will answer them. One that we had from earlier was, does it make sense to provide financial incentives to people that minimize their energy usage? Obviously, Hong Kong's already doing some of that in terms of subsidizing energy bills, but is there more that can be done to reward good behavior? I guess I can pass it to Averey for a little bit.
Mute. Let me just unmute. Yeah. So right now, I think the key policy that we've actually touched on a lot already is the feed-in tariff. But I think the question there was talking about whether there should be subsidies for or incentives to actually reduce your energy usage. So I think it's a very good point. But I think the very hard thing to do there and about implementing that is actually measuring that. How do you measure whether someone has reduced their usage? Is that because they've moved house? Have they stopped using a certain type of equipment? And would that have changed anyway? So these are a lot of things that are very hard to measure and very hard to actually incentivize in that way. So I understand the idea behind it, but I think in terms of actual implementation, it can be a very difficult thing to do. And I think that is very much the key issue around that kind of incentive, where you have to measure what you're incentivizing first. I think that's the difficult thing to do first, yeah.
Great. And I guess the last question, again, I'll pose it to the whole panel. Anyone that wants to take it can take it. But looking at emerging technologies, things like solar roads, solar glazing, floating PV, maybe some other things. What do you think of some of the slightly more radical technologies that might be applicable, to Hong Kong or the wider world in the next decade or so? I guess, Cameron, if you want to take a stab at it.
Sure. Okay, sure. I think there are a lot of really cool radical innovations I read about every day. I had a list of really cool outliers in terms of like how ubiquitous they become. I'm still not sure, right? Because these are really, really like impressive, innovative technologies, but you never know what the roadmap looks like. In terms of concrete ones that I think will be transformative for Hong Kong, I would say, I think energy storage is going to make a tremendous amount of difference. I understand the way that you've kind of cautioned about that, Averey, and that we don't necessarily have the right incentives for energy storage right now, maybe in Hong Kong. But I do think with the investments in lithium and nickel in the country, I think that's where we're going to notice the greatest efficiency gains, which are just going to help the economics of renewables, as well as compressed air storage and salt cavern storage. Another one that I think will be quite transformative is, I mean, I know China is so this one's not related to renewables. This is related to my side project. So I also do, I'm part of a company in Canada that does drone-based reforestation. So we're planting trees with drones, and with the amount that China has kind of invested in reforestation in recent years, I'm very excited to kind of see what kind of tangible environmental innovations are coming out. I do think that is probably going to be the next frontier there. But yeah, probably in terms of energy efficiency, I would say energy storage is probably going to be the most transformative, I think, for the next decade or two.
Yeah, and I'll definitely add on to that as well. So energy storage is definitely, so there's actually conflicting ideas about how the cost of energy storage is going to go. With this current technology, you mentioned lithium and nickel. There's definitely issues with nickel in terms of the supply. This is cobalt actually is the main one. Cobalt is the main one that has issues in terms of the supply, and also kind of ethical issues around the way that it's mined as well. So really that's interesting to see. It will be very interesting to see in the next 10 years about how battery trends will go. I mean, definitely energy storage is the way forward, and it's the way that we will get more flexible renewable energy. But I think the interesting thing will be seeing what form that takes. I mean, there's many different types of energy storage. Christina also mentioned hydrogen, and these are all different ways that we might see storage in the future. So that's all very interesting. And I think to answer Tom's question about Hong Kong in particular and these kinds of technologies, floating PV is definitely an interesting prospect for Hong Kong. We have reservoirs, which could be interesting for implementing there. But recently I've seen pilot projects in, I think it was in the Netherlands, where they've actually had open sea floating solar. That's much more difficult because of the salt water. You get much more corrosion. It's also a lot more rugged in terms of the cyclic stress that the panels have to go through. But if that can be implemented in Hong Kong, because of all the islands and the space that we have around it, there's actually a lot of opportunity for that in terms of Hong Kong increasing its renewable energy penetration. So I think that could be quite exciting, although that is very new technology and quite up and coming. Yeah.
Great, and I guess with that last word, we'll wrap things up for this panel. I'd just like to say a big thank you to my four panelists, Max, Christina, Cameron, and Averey. Thank you very much for sort of enlightening us, especially me, sort of about the reach and the work that is being done around the world, not just in terms of places like Hong Kong, but also new types of technologies like drone reforestation and all the different carbon credits and AI things. I think it was all extremely enlightening. And to the rest of our audience, I'd just like to reinforce the impact of individual action as well. You know, my generation, and a lot of your generations, a millennial generation is now starting to grow up, and I think as we grow up, we are becoming, you know, more influential in politics. We have a little bit more of our money to invest, and I think putting our money and our actions where our mouth is something that can drive real change globally, because companies and enterprises, they will follow that. If you stop supporting companies that do the wrong thing, they'll be more incentivized to do the right thing. So I just want to stress to everyone, and as Cameron said, I think the future does look bright, even if sometimes there are moments where it can be a bit bleak. So I'd like to thank everyone again and end this panel. So thank you very much, everyone. And I'd like to thank Accelerate for hosting us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom, for an awesome panel.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye, everyone.